Before we begin, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you enjoy these long, calming journeys through history, please remember to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more of these quiet documentaries night after night. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is right now. I always enjoy seeing where in the world these stories are keeping you company. Asterisk. The city of Troy, before the war began the Aegean world in the late Bronze Age, was not quiet. Beyond the myths of gods, heroes, and divine feuds, there stood a city of stone and mud brick, a place that commanded attention not because of its legends, but because of its location. That city was Troy. If you close your eyes and imagine the ancient landscape, you would see a settlement perched near the mouth of the Dardanelles Strait. What was once called the Hellespont. Here, the waters connected the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, and with it came the flow of ships, traders, and wealth. Troy was not the largest city in the ancient world, nor was it the most powerful, but it sat at a crossroads, and that alone made it a prize worth fighting for. Archaeologists, digging through the soil of Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey, have uncovered layer upon layer of ruined cities. Each layer represents centuries of human effort, rebuilding over the ashes of the last. By the time the Trojan War is said to have begun sometime around the 12th or 13th century BC, the city had already lived many lives. Walls had been raised, toppled, and raised again. Houses had been built and abandoned. The Troy remembered in legend was already an old city with roots stretching deep into prehistory inside its walls. Daily life unfolded in ways that were not glamorous, but essential. Mud brick houses, simple in design, lined narrow lanes. Families cooked meals over open hearths, their smoke rising into the air and leaving black stains on the plaster ceilings. Pottery, not precious metals, was the most common household possession. Clay jars stored grain. Small cups held wine. Wide bowls carried barley or lentils for evening stews. The city itself was not silent. You would hear donkeys braying as traders unloaded goods, children calling out as they played in the dust, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers as craftsmen shaped bronze tools. Bronze made from copper and tin was the material of survival. Without it, there would be no plows, no swords, no armor, no fishing hooks. Troy's smiths kept their forges alive, smoke curling into the air, the faint scent of burning charcoal clinging to everything. Troy's wealth did not come from endless fields of farmland. Instead, it came from its position as a toll station for the world. Ships from Greece, Anatolia, and beyond passed its shores. Traders carried goods from the Black Sea, grain, timber, and fish. Others brought precious metals from distant lands. To pass these waters, one often had to deal with Troy, a tax, a negotiation, or perhaps a partnership. This mundane detail, the control of trade, was one of the quiet reasons why Troy mattered. Wars often spring not from insults or stories of stolen brides, but from disputes over resources and wealth. Beyond trade, Troy was also a cultural crossroads. Within its walls, languages mixed. The Trojans themselves likely spoke an Anatolian language related to Hittite, but in the markets, you might have heard Greek merchants haggling, Luwian scribes making notes, or distant accents from sailors who had traveled far. Troy was not a city of one identity, but of many, and that gave it both strength and vulnerability. If you were to stand on the city's walls, you would see a landscape of both opportunity and danger. To the west lay the Aegean, shimmering under the sun, filled with ships. To the east stretched the plains of Anatolia, fertile enough for farming, but open enough for armies to march across. And to the north, Strait itself, narrow passage of water that brought strangers every day. The people of Troy lived with rhythms that were not extraordinary, but human. Women drew water from wells, carrying jars balanced on their shoulders. Farmers guided oxen across the soil, scratching the earth with wooden plows tipped in bronze. Shepherds led flocks of sheep and goats across the hillsides. In the evenings, families gathered in courtyards. Their meals, simple barley bread, coats, cheese, perhaps olives, figs, or dried fish. These are the details often forgotten in tales of heroes, but they were the heartbeat of the city. And yet, beneath this normalcy, there was always tension. For centuries, Troy had been rebuilt after destruction. Each generation knew that safety was never permanent. Beyond its walls, rival powers lurked. The Hittite Empire to the east, Mycenaean kings to the west. To live in Troy was to live with the knowledge that fortune could shift suddenly. And peace was fragile. As night fell, the city would not be dark. Oil lamps flickered in doorways. The sound of lyres could sometimes be heard, their strings plucked softly. Priests conducted rituals to the gods, offering small sacrifices to ensure protection. The gods worshipped here were not the glamorous Olympians of later Greek myth, but older deities tied to earth, sky, and hearth. In times of uncertainty, rituals gave a sense of order. And so, before the war began, Troy was not a city of legends, but of routines. Its strength lay not in the tales of heroes, but in the ordinary lives of its people: farmers, potters, smiths, shepherds, traders. They lived as many others lived in the Bronze Age, with work, with faith, with a quiet hope that tomorrow would be safe. But history does not always favor the quiet. Troy's very success, its wealth, its trade, its walls invited envy. Across the sea, Mycenaean kings watched, and their ambitions grew. In time, those ambitions would bring armies to Troy's gates. And here lies the question: was it truly love and insult, as the myths say, that brought about Troy's fall, or was it the quieter, duller, but more powerful forces of trade, wealth, and survival that doomed the city? Asterisk, when we look beyond myth, the world of Troy becomes clearer through what archaeologists have uncovered. At Hisarlik, the mound that holds the ruins of Troy, 9 main layers of settlement have been identified, stacked one upon another, like the pages of a book written over centuries. By the time of the late Bronze Age, Troy had reached a stage archaeologists call Troy VI and Troy VII. These layers show a city fortified with massive stone walls, some up to 5 meters thick, built with a care that spoke of constant awareness of danger. The walls themselves reveal more than defense. They show how the people of Troy wanted to be seen. Constructed with sloping limestone blocks at the base and mud brick rising above, they gave an impression of permanence. Gates were built with towers, allowing defenders to look out across the plains. Approaching the city, a traveler would have been struck by the strength of those walls, not just barriers, but symbols of a city determined to endure. Inside the walls, the streets were uneven and narrow, running between houses clustered in blocks. The wealthiest citizens lived in larger homes, sometimes with multiple rooms and storage areas. These dwellings may have had plastered walls, painted in simple earth tones. For ordinary families, space was cramped, shared by people, animals, and goods alike. Floors were often packed to earth, swept clean, but never polished. Wooden beams supported flat roofs, where people might dry grain in the sun. One of the striking finds from Troy's ruins is evidence of storage jars, large pythoi buried in the ground to keep food supplies cool. These jars contained grain, olive oil, or wine. Their presence suggests that Troy prepared itself carefully for times of scarcity. To live in such a place was to plan for siege, famine, or interruption of trade. Security was not only in the walls, but in the quiet preparation of food reserves that could mean survival when markets closed and fields lay abandoned. The people of Troy were not isolated. Their pottery styles show connections with both Anatolian and Aegean traditions. Mycenaean pottery, easily recognized by its painted designs, has been found in the ruins. Proof of trade, or perhaps of Mycenaean presence in the city itself. Jewelry, tools, and ornaments also reveal influences from many cultures. A Trojan citizen might have worn a necklace of imported glass beads, or used a bronze knife whose metal came from distant mines in Cyprus or central Anatolia. Religion held a strong place in daily life. Shrines within the city likely honored protective gods and household deities. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary, but inscriptions in nearby regions suggest the worship of storm gods, mother goddesses, and protector spirits tied to the land. Rituals may have been as simple as pouring wine on the ground before drinking, or as elaborate as animal sacrifice at seasonal festivals. These acts were not just for devotion. They reassured people that the world, chaotic and dangerous as it was, remained bound to divine order. Beyond religion, there was law and governance. Troy would not have functioned without leadership. The city likely had a king, a figure who managed relations with the nearby powers and organized defenses. Yet such rule was not absolute. Beneath the king stood officials, elders, and administrators who ensured that trade flowed and that disputes between citizens were managed. Ordinary Trojans lived lives full of labor, but not without moments of rest. In the evenings, after tending fields or crafts, families may have gathered to share food, tell stories, and sing songs. Music was not a luxury, but a part of human rhythm. Lyres, flutes, and drums accompanied gatherings, offering a small escape from hardship. Children played with clay figurines or simple carved toys, not so different from children anywhere in the ancient world. The plains outside the city stretched wide, fertile but vulnerable. Farmers raised wheat and barley, tended orchards of figs and olives, and herded animals. Seasonal rhythms shaped existence: planting in spring, harvest in late summer, storage in autumn. Winter brought storms from the Aegean and long, damp nights when fires had to be kept alive. To live here was to know the cycles of earth and sky intimately, and to work with them or suffer hunger. And all the while, across the waters, the Mycenaean Greeks grew stronger. Their palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos stood as centers of wealth and power. They too valued trade, and they looked eastward with interest. For them, Troy was not simply another city. It was a rival, perhaps even a barrier, standing between them and the riches of the Black Sea. Here lies the deeper truth. When war came, it may not have been because of Helen's fabled beauty, but because of this silent contest over resources, trade, and influence. The story remembered in poetry is vivid, but beneath it lies the quieter, more practical, because the struggle for survival and advantage in a world where nothing came easily. And so, as Troy thrived behind its walls, preparing for both feast and famine, the seeds of conflict were already sown. Ships would cross the Aegean, kings would gather allies, and the quiet rhythms of Trojan life would be disturbed forever. But the question remains, in these years before the war, did the people of Troy sense what was coming? Or did they live in the fragile illusion that their walls and their gods would protect them? Asterisk, the city of Troy, before its destruction, stood at a fragile balance between routine and risk. For its citizens, the days were not marked by looming armies, but by the mundane tasks that have always defined human life. And yet, when we look back through both myth and archaeology, we see a place always poised at the edge of conflict. The city's defenses reveal much about this tension. The great walls of Troy, with their sloping bases and imposing towers, were not only physical barriers, but psychological ones. They reminded the people within that safety was something to be guarded carefully, never taken for granted. At times, new layers of walls were built upon older ones, reinforcing the idea that each generation lived with the expectation of threats. Children growing up in Troy would have known the sound of masons at work, chiseling stone and laying brick, the background rhythm of a city intent on survival. Beneath this surface of strength, however, lay vulnerability. Archaeologists have found signs of destruction and rebuilding in several layers of the city. Fires, toppled walls, and hastily patched defenses suggest that Troy's history was punctuated by sudden disasters. Whether these came from earthquakes, raids, or larger campaigns, they left scars on the city and its people. Each scar reminded them that fortune was temporary. Economically, Troy thrived because it stood at a junction. Its control of passage into the Black Sea made it more than a city. It was a gatekeeper of commerce. Ships that passed through these waters could not ignore it. Taxes, tribute, and partnerships enriched Troy, but also painted it as a target. This strategic position was both a gift and a burden, ensuring wealth while inviting envy. The city's prosperity shows itself in the artifacts uncovered, fine pottery, imported goods, and traces of workshops. Smiths and artisans played central roles. A bronze dagger or sword was more than a tool of war. It was a symbol of status, carefully crafted and passed down through generations. The skills of these workers kept the city tied to the wider networks of the Bronze Age, where metal, stone, and even luxury items like ivory traveled across seas. Religion also bound the community together. Shrines and altars, though modest, were essential in providing reassurance. Each offering of grain, each burnt sacrifice, was not only a gesture of devotion, but also a collective act of stability. People looked to the gods for favor, but also for order in a world that often seemed unpredictable. When storms rolled in from the sea, or when tremors shook the earth, prayers and rituals reminded them that they were not alone. Even if protection was uncertain socially, Troy was a place of hierarchies. At the top, the king and his household commanded attention, managing diplomacy and defense. Below them, officials and elders managed trade, agriculture, and daily disputes. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, and laborers formed the backbone of the city, their work sustaining its walls and markets. Slaves, too, were likely present, as in much of the Bronze Age world, carrying out the tasks that required endless, unseen effort. For women, life was both domestic and vital. They managed households, prepared food, raised children, and likely assisted in farming and weaving. Loom weights found in excavations suggest that textiles were a key part of Troy's economy. Women's work, often silent in historical accounts, filled storerooms and clothed the city. The woven cloths of Troy may have been traded far beyond its walls, spreading its presence across the seas. Yet, for all of these details, what made Troy legendary was not what it was, but what it represented. To the Mycenaean Greeks across the water, it was an obstacle and an opportunity. To the Hittites inland, it was both a rival and a potential ally. To the local peoples of Anatolia, it was a powerful neighbor that might offer protection or demand submission. To live in Troy was to exist at the intersection of many worlds, each with its own ambitions. And so, before the war began, Troy was a city that carried both pride and anxiety. Pride in its wealth, its walls, its survival across centuries. Anxiety in the knowledge that these things could be taken away. The myths speak of Paris, Helen, and divine quarrels. The archaeology speaks of trade, fortifications, and survival. Between them lies the truth. Troy mattered not only because of stories, but because of its place in the world. The final years before the war may have felt no different from those that came before. Farmers planted their seeds, merchants sold their wares, children played in the streets. But the storm was gathering. Across the sea, kings with ambitions were preparing ships. Rumors may already have reached Troy, whispers of Greek lords uniting, of armies building. Did the Trojans dismiss these stories, or did they sense that something greater was about to unfold? This is the question that lingers when the sun set over Troy in those last peaceful seasons. Did its people see their city as eternal, or did some already fear that the coming tide would sweep it away? Asterisk, when we speak of the Trojan War, we often imagine a single city surrounded by armies, but Troy did not exist in isolation. Its story unfolded in the larger world of the Bronze Age, a time when kingdoms rose and fell, when distant lands were bound together by fragile threads of trade, and when the smallest disruption could ripple across entire regions. To understand Troy, we must also understand the world around it. In the centuries leading to the war, the eastern Mediterranean was a patchwork of powerful states and smaller polities. To the east lay the Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, stretching across what is now Turkey and into Syria. The Hittites ruled through kings who claimed divine authority, supported by scribes who recorded treaties, grain counts, and royal decrees in clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script. Their capital, Hattusa, stood hundreds of kilometers inland, fortified by massive walls. From there, roads radiated outward, binding together vassal states with obligations of tribute and military support. To the south, in Egypt, pharaohs ruled a land of monuments and fields sustained by the Nile. Egypt's influence reached into Canaan and the Levant, regions that served as both trading partners and contested frontiers. Egyptian records, preserved in temples and tombs, mention encounters with northern peoples, seafarers, traders, and sometimes raiders who may well have included ancestors of those who fought at Troy. Further west, across the Aegean, the Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece thrived. Palaces like Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were not simply royal houses, but centers of administration. There, scribes used a script called Linear B to record lists of livestock, jars of oil, and shipments of grain. These records, dull at first glance, reveal a world. It was in this wider web that Troy found itself. Its strategic position near the Dardanelles placed it directly between the Aegean and the Black Sea. Grain from the northern steppes, timber from the forests, and precious metals moved along these routes. Control of this passage meant influence far greater than Troy's size might suggest. To the Mycenaeans, eager for resources, and to the Hittites, keen to secure their western borders, Troy's role was both valuable and contested. The Bronze Age was not only about kings and palaces. Ordinary life tied these empires together. Farmers in Anatolia grew barley and wheat much as farmers in Greece or Egypt did. Shepherds tended flocks, their wool feeding the textile industries that clothed armies and households alike. Merchants carried goods along dusty roads or across the sea in ships built with planks fastened by wooden pegs and sealed with pitch. These ships, though fragile by modern standards, were lifelines of commerce. Sailors navigated by stars, coastlines, and experience passed down through generations. The sea was not just a barrier, but a highway, connecting worlds that might otherwise have remained distant. A single amphora of wine from Greece could find its way to Anatolia. A jar of olive oil from Crete could end up in Egypt. Each object was a link in a chain stretching across continents. But this interconnectedness also meant fragility. A drought in one land could disrupt trade in another. A war in Anatolia could ripple into Greece. The fall of a single city could shift alliances and close routes, leaving others scrambling to adapt. The Bronze Age was a world of balance, and Troy stood directly at one of its most delicate points. Cultural exchange shaped identities as much as trade did. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Troy, while Anatolian styles influenced Greek artisans. Religious ideas, too, traveled with merchants and diplomats. Storm gods of Anatolia bore similarities to the sky gods of Greece. Earth mothers and fertility deities echoed across cultures, each adapted to local traditions but sharing underlying themes. Diplomacy bound this world together. Treaties recorded in Hittite archives mention Walusa, a name many scholars believe refers to Troy. These documents reveal negotiations, oaths sworn, promises made, often fragile, sometimes broken. They show Troy not as an isolated outpost, but as a player in the great political games of its time, balancing between the powers of East and West. And yet, for all this grandeur, the rhythms of life remained ordinary. Families lit fires at dusk, tended crops at dawn, and prayed for rain in seasons of drought. Children played in courtyards while elders recited stories of ancestors. Armies might march and kings might scheme, but for most people, the world was measured in harvests, hearth fires, and the steady labor of survival. This was the world that framed the Trojan War, a fragile system of trade, power, and diplomacy sustained by the labor of countless unseen hands, a system that could, and eventually did, unravel. But as we consider this broader stage, another question rises. When Troy's walls finally faced Greek armies, was it merely a local conflict? Or was it the echo of a much larger struggle, the collapse of a world already stretched too thin? Asterisk. The Bronze Age world was bound together, not by myth, but by a network of trade, diplomacy, and fragile alliances. Troy's place within this world can only be understood by looking outward to the kingdoms and peoples that surrounded it, each with their own ambitions and anxieties. To the east, the Hittite Empire held sway over much of Anatolia. Its kings ruled from Hattusa, a city surrounded by stone walls that still trace their outline across the hills of modern Turkey. Clay tablets discovered their tell of treaties, battles, and negotiations with cities on the empire's western frontier. Among these, the name Walusa appears, a word many scholars believe refers to Troy. These texts reveal not only conflict, but also diplomacy, oaths sworn in the names of gods, vassal obligations, and delicate balances of loyalty. Troy, it seems, was not simply a city under siege in legend, but a participant in the political negotiations of its time. Southward, the Egyptian pharaohs watched the Mediterranean with wary eyes. Their inscriptions speak of foreign peoples who came by sea, some as traders, others as raiders. Ships from the Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond would have been familiar sights in Levantan ports. The Egyptians saw these northerners as both partners and threats. Their presence, a reminder that the sea could carry both wealth and danger. In this broader picture, Troy was part of the same maritime web. A ship that passed its shores might eventually dock in Cyprus, Ugarit, or Egypt, carrying goods that crossed entire regions. The Mycenaean Greeks across the Aegean formed another vital piece of this world. Their palaces were centers of both culture and calculation. At Pylos, scribes used clay tablets to record the distribution of bronze, the tallying of sheep, and the movement of grain. These records, written in the linear B script, may seem dull compared to epic poetry, but they are revealing. They show societies obsessed with accounting, with controlling resources down to the smallest detail. War, when it came, was fed by this system. Armies marched because palaces organized the food, weapons, and supplies that made it possible between these great centers. Hattusa, Thebes, Mycenae, and others stood smaller cities like Troy, though not as vast as empires. They controlled critical points along trade routes. A single city could block access to the Black Sea or open pathways to distant markets. In this sense, Troy's strength came not from size, but from geography. It was a hinge between worlds. Daily life across this interconnected Bronze Age world reflected both diversity and similarity. Farmers from Anatolia to Egypt grew similar grains. Wheat and barley were the staples. Olive oil and wine became markers of wealth and status. Sheep and goats roamed hillsides from Greece to the Levant, their wool and milk sustaining entire economies. Craftsmen in distant lands worked with similar tools, each shaping bronze, carving stone, or firing clay with methods that echoed across borders. The ships that carried these goods reveal much about the fragility of the system. Constructed from wooden planks, joined by mortise and tenon joints, and sealed with pitch, they were vulnerable to storms and piracy. Yet, they carried amphorae of wine, copper ingots, and even luxury goods such as glass or ivory. The Uluburun shipwreck off the coast of Turkey, dating to the late Bronze Age, is a silent witness to this world. Its cargo held goods from at least 7 different regions, from Cypriot copper, Danubian ivory. That ship never reached its destination, but its remains show how deeply connected the Bronze Age world was, and how much depended on the sea. Religion formed another shared thread across cultures. Storm gods loomed in Anatolia, sky gods in Greece, sun gods in Egypt. Different names, similar roles. The rituals varied, but the underlying beliefs spoke to common human concerns: protection from storms, fertility of fields, victory in war. When treaties were signed, they invoked these gods, binding oaths with divine oversight for the people of Troy. As for their neighbors, faith was not an abstract idea, but a tool for survival, a way to give order to a precarious existence. Yet, for all this interconnection, cracks were forming. Records from Ugarit, a city on the Levanten coast, show appeals for aid as enemies approached. The Hittite Empire faced unrest on its borders. In Greece, palaces that had stood for centuries would soon fall into ruins. This was the world in which Troy existed, a world of links that made cities rich, but also fragile. So when the war came to Troy, was it only about the insult of Paris taking Helen, or was it part of this broader unraveling, a symptom of a world already collapsing under its own weight? Asterisk, the Bronze Age world was as much a network of relationships as it was a collection of cities and kingdoms. Troy, standing on the edge of the Aegean in Anatolia, was one node in this vast web, connected by trade, diplomacy, and conflict to lands far beyond its walls. To see how fragile that world was, we must look at the signs of its coming collapse. Archaeology gives us glimpses of that unraveling. In the Levant, at cities like Ugarit, letters written on clay tablets preserved the voices of rulers calling desperately for help as enemies approached. These were not mythic enemies, but ordinary threats: raiders, famine, shifting alliances. The enemy's ships are here. One tablet reads, "My cities are burning, and there is no one to save us." The words were never answered. The city fell, its palaces left in ashes. Asterisk, similar stories repeat across the Mediterranean. In Greece, the great palaces of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos, once centers of order, were abandoned or destroyed. Linear B tablets, left half-baked in the fires that consumed their archives, remain as mute evidence of the collapse. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, which had stood for centuries, crumbled into fragments. Egypt, too, faced waves of sea-borne raiders, the so-called sea peoples, who appeared suddenly in its records as both destroyers and desperate migrants. Asterisk. For Troy, positioned at the intersection of these currents, the stakes were immense. Its wealth from trade relied on the stability of surrounding regions. Its political role depended on balancing the Hittites to the east and the Mycenaeans to the west. If either side faltered, Troy's position could turn from strength to vulnerability in an instant. And yet, daily life continued in the midst of this shifting world. Farmers still planted barley in Anatolian fields. Shepherds still drove flocks across Greek hillsides, and merchants still risked the sea with fragile ships. What we call collapse was, for them, a slow tightening, fewer ships arriving, fewer goods in markets, rumors of distant battles that grew closer each season. For most, it was not the drama of a single day. but the grinding uncertainty of years when the old systems no longer worked. Religious life in this period reflects the anxiety. Archaeological finds suggest more emphasis on protective deities, on rituals of defense and survival. In Greece, shrines shifted from palatial centers to smaller, more local places of worship. In Anatolia, gods of storm and war were invoked more frequently in treaties. Even in Egypt, inscriptions describe pharaohs as defenders against chaos from the sea. Across cultures, the language of survival became sharper, as if people sensed that the world was tilting. Troy, in this broader frame, was not merely a stage for a single war, but a participant in the slow drama of the Bronze Age collapse. Its walls, its trade, its alliances, all were tested in the same pressures that brought down palaces and cities across the Mediterranean. The war, remembered in poetry, may have been one conflict among many, magnified by memory, but it also echoed the larger truth that the age itself was breaking apart. The question is not only why Troy fell, but why so much of the Bronze Age world fell with it. Was it drought, famine, invasion, or the cumulative weight of fragile systems stretched too thin? And in that question lies the heart of Troy's story. Was the war the cause of collapse, or simply one chapter in a world already unraveling? Asterisk, when we turn our gaze westward across the Aegean, the story of Troy becomes inseparable from the ambitions of the Mycenaean kings. These rulers, seated in fortified palaces of stone and commanding networks of power, were the ones who sailed eastward when the call for war came. Their ambitions, long before the Trojan War, shaped the Bronze Age world in ways that left Troy vulnerable. The Mycenaean world was not a single kingdom, but a patchwork of centers of power. At Mycenae, Tyrants, Pylos, Thebes, and elsewhere, rulers sat at the top of highly organized systems. Archaeology has uncovered their palatial compounds, massive walls, storerooms filled with jars, archives of clay tablets, and workshops for bronze, textiles, and pottery. These were not the chaotic courts of heroic myth, but carefully run administrations, where every resource was accounted for. Linear B tablets, preserved by the fires that destroyed these palaces, revealed the mundane details of their power. Lists of sheep, inventories of bronze, allocations of grain, all written in neat columns. These records may seem dull, but they show a system obsessed with control. Every farmer owed produce, every craftsman his labor, every field its harvest. From these obligations came the resources that allowed Mycenaean kings to command armies and fleets. The kings themselves, known in later Greek tradition as wainaks, stood at the top of this hierarchy. They held not only political power, but religious authority. Festivals, sacrifices, and rituals all reinforced their status as chosen figures, blessed by the gods. Their palaces were not only residences, but also sacred centers, where religious and political life blended seamlessly. To defy the wainaks was to disrupt both worldly and divine order. Beneath the king stood officials, often called lawajitas, or leaders of the people, and scribes, who ensured the palace functioned. These administrators managed the flow of goods in and out, the conscription of men, and the taxation of land. It was through their quiet labor that the ambitions of the king became possible. The Trojan War, if it truly took place, would have been fueled by such organization, a system that could feed thousands of men on campaign for years. But ambition was not only administrative, it was also territorial. The Mycenaeans looked outward across the Aegean, establishing settlements and outposts on islands and coastal regions. Pottery from Greece has been found as far as Cyprus and Anatolia, suggesting both trade and influence. Mycenaean swords, distinctive in their shape, appear in distant graves, carried by warriors, or exchanged as gifts. Step by step, the Mycenaean kings extended their presence beyond their mainland homes, weaving themselves into the fabric of the wider Bronze Age world. This outward gaze often brought them into tension with powers like the Hittites. Treaties and letters from Hattusa mention conflicts with Aegean leaders. The term Ayawa, widely thought to refer to the Mycenaeans. These texts describe disputes over cities in western Anatolia, hints of military campaigns and negotiations over borders. Long before the Trojan War, Mycenaean rulers were already pressing eastward, testing the edges of Hittite control. Troy, standing at the hinge of this frontier, was inevitably drawn into these contests. Life under these kings was not equally shared. The elite enjoyed luxury gold masks, ivory inlays, fine pottery, and imported goods. Graves at Mycenae, rich with treasures, testify to their wealth. But for ordinary farmers, life was laborious and controlled. They provided grain, wool, and manpower, while their lords displayed the splendor. The ambitions of the kings were built on the back of this labor, unseen, yet essential. And yet, for all their wealth and power, the Mycenaean kings ruled in a world of constant competition. Each palace was strong, but none was supreme. Rivalries shaped their politics as much as alliances did. When the war against Troy came, tradition says it was a coalition. Many kings joining under a high commander, united more by opportunity than by natural unity. That unity was fragile, just as their power at home was fragile, dependent on resources that could never be guaranteed. This, then, was the world of the Mycenaean kings, wealthy yet precarious, ambitious yet insecure, reaching outward to secure what they feared losing. Their gaze toward Troy was not an accident of myth, but an extension of long-standing expansion of kings who saw opportunity across the sea and sought to grasp it. But it raises a question. Did these kings see Troy only as an obstacle to trade, or as a symbol, a city whose capture would prove their strength to rivals at home as much as to enemies abroad? Asterisk, the ambitions of the Mycenaean kings cannot be separated from the system that sustained them. Their palaces were not only seats of power, but engines of extraction. Every tablet that survives from their archives reveals the fine threads of control, the tallying of livestock, the careful distribution of bronze, the management of harvests. This was not administration for its own sake. It was the machinery of ambition, the foundation upon which wars could be planned and fleets assembled. The palace at Pylos offers one of the clearest glimpses into this system. Excavated storerooms contained rows of jars, each capable of holding vast quantities of oil or grain. Inscriptions tell us how wool was collected, distributed, and woven into textiles under palace oversight. Bronze was issued to smiths, who in turn owed finished weapons or tools to the palace. These were not free markets. They were command systems, with the king and his administrators at the center. Ambition, therefore, rested not only on the dreams of rulers, but on the enforced labor and obedience of thousands of Tories. Subjects, thus structure extended to the military. Linear bead tablets record allocations of equipment, chariots, armor, weapons. Men were conscripted, their obligations noted, their service expected. The image of heroic warriors may dominate later poetry, but the reality was one of bureaucratic preparation. Soldiers were not simply adventurers. They were resources, tallied and deployed by the palace machine. It is in this light that the Trojan War, if it truly reflected a historical conflict, should be understood. It's a campaign enabled by a meticulous system of logistics. Archaeology offers further evidence of ambition turned outward. Mycenaean pottery has been found far beyond the Greek mainland, from Italy to Cyprus, from Anatolia to Egypt. Such finds suggest not only trade, but also influence the projection of Mycenaean presence across the sea. Ships carried jars of oil, fine drinking vessels, and weapons, leaving behind traces of a culture that sought to expand. Each artifact is a quiet witness to a world where rulers did not confine themselves to their walls, but reached outward, testing and extending their influence. The Hittite archives provide another perspective. Letters from Hattusa refer to the Ahiawa, widely believed to mean the Mycenaean Greeks. These texts describe disputes over western Anatolia, mentions of great kings across the sea, and contested control of cities. Among these contested places may have been Walusa. The city scholars identify with Troy. If so, then the Trojan War remembered in poetry could be one echo of these long-standing disputes, transformed in memory, but rooted in real struggles for influence. The ambitions of the Mycenaean rulers were not only directed outward, but also inward. Rivalries between palaces meant that no king could rest secure. Mycene, Tyrants, Pylos, Thebes, Athens, each sought to assert itself, to dominate its neighbors. Ambition, therefore, was not a luxury, but a necessity. To appear weak was to invite challenge. War abroad could strengthen the king's authority at home, providing both wealth from plunder and prestige from victory. Troy, in this sense, may have been less about necessity than about opportunity, an enemy that could unify rivals and display Mycenaean strength. Still, ambition was costly. Every campaign required supplies, every palace required labor, every king required loyalty. When resources thinned, so too did power. The later collapse of the Mycenaean palaces shows how fragile this system was, dependent on constant flows of goods and labor. But in the generations before that collapse, ambition drove the kings to build higher, reach farther, and demand more. Amid this world, we must imagine the ordinary lives caught up in the ambitions of their rulers. Farmers harvested grain not for their families alone, but for storage in palace jars. Shepherds tended flocks whose wool clothed not only local people, but also fed the trade networks that enriched kings. Craftsmen forged weapons they might never wield, destined instead for soldiers sent abroad. For them, ambition was not a choice, but a burden carried in silence. And yet, it was this burden that gave the kings their power. Without the labor of thousands, without the dull, repetitive work of farming, weaving, smelting, and shipping, no palace could have risen, no war could have been waged. Ambition was therefore not the dream of kings alone, but the collective output of a society compelled to serve them. This leads us to ask, when Mycenaean kings looked eastward to Troy, did they truly see only a city of strategic value? Or did they also see a stage, a place where their ambitions could be proven, their rivals subdued, and their names remembered? The Mycenaean kings who ruled across the Greek mainland did not exist as solitary figures of legend, but as rulers bound by a world of expectations, rivalries, pride, and fragile stability. Their ambitions were shaped as much by necessity as by desire. For in the Bronze Age, power had to be displayed, defended, and continually renewed. The palaces of Mycenae, Tyrants, and Pylos were not only seats of governance, but monuments of authority. Cyclopean walls, vast stones so large that later Greeks believed only giants could have placed them, loomed above their subjects. Within these walls lay Megaron's large audience halls with central hearths, where kings received guests, conducted rituals, and made decisions of state. The architecture itself was a declaration. Power resided here, and here it would be shown. Such displays mattered, for the kings competed with one another. Unlike the later monarchies of classical Greece, there was no single hegemon in the Mycenaean world. Each palace stood as a rival, commanding its own territories, its own armies, its own resources. Unity, when it came, was fragile and opportunistic. The tradition that the Trojan War brought them together under one commander, Agamemnon of Mycenae, reflects both the potential and the fragility of this system. To gather many kings for a single campaign required careful negotiation, promises of reward, and assurances of prestige. War itself was both a danger and an opportunity. Victories brought wealth, slaves, and prestige, reinforcing a ruler's authority. Defeats threatened legitimacy. For a king who failed in war risked losing the confidence of his people and the respect of his rivals. Ambition, therefore, demanded both boldness and caution. The decision to wage war against Troy, whether as a historical reality or as a reflection of broader Mycenaean aggression, fit within this pattern. It was not only about resources, but about reputation. The evidence of Mycenaean warfare supports this picture. Graves and hoards contain weapons of bronze, long swords, short thrusting blades, spearheads, and arrowheads. Suits of armor, though rare, revealed that some warriors fought heavily protected, perhaps as elite champions. Chariots, mentioned in Linear B tablets, added speed and spectacle to the battlefield. Yet, behind these images of warriors lay the organization of palaces, the smiths who forged, the farmers who supplied grain, the sailors who rowed ships. Every battle was the end result of countless hours of ordinary labor. Ambition also took cultural forms. The Mycenaeans borrowed and adapted from the civilizations around them. From Minoan Crete, they took artistic styles and administrative techniques. From Anatolia and the Near East, they absorbed influences in religion and warfare. To display imported goods, fine ivory carvings, glass beads, or exotic metals was to display a ruler's reach. Ambition meant not only controlling territory, but showing connection to distant lands. This network of ambition was inherently unstable. Each palace demanded more resources, more displays of wealth, more victories. The system worked so long as the flows of goods and labor continued, but when drought, invasion, or internal unrest disrupted them, the palaces began to falter. The collapse of the Mycenaean world in the late Bronze Age shows how fragile their ambitions truly were. Walls that had stood for centuries fell silent, archives were abandoned, and kings vanished into obscurity. Troy, in this context, was not merely a city across the sea, but a focal point for Mycenaean ambition. To control Troy was to control a gate of trade, to prove strength against Anatolian rivals, and to unify competing kings under a single cause. Whether the war happened, as later poetry describes, or whether it reflects a series of smaller conflicts, the ambitions of the Mycenaean rulers made such a campaign possible, even inevitable. And so, as we consider these kings, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, and others remembered in legend, we must strip away the layers of myth to see the ambitions beneath. They were rulers of palaces, dependent on fragile systems, driven to display strength and compelled by rivalry. Their gaze toward Troy was both practical and symbolic, a city to be conquered, a victory to be displayed, a memory to be secured. The lingering question is this: did their ambition create the war? Or did the war create their ambition, magnifying their power and memory long after their palaces had crumbled to dust? Asterisk, long before the clash of armies and the burning of walls, Troy's importance lay not in myth, but in geography. The city sat at the threshold of waters that connected to seas, the Aegean and the Black Sea. To modern eyes, this may seem an ordinary detail of maps and coastlines, but in the Bronze Age, it was everything. Troy's wealth, its survival, Achaea, and perhaps even the wars waged against it, flowed from this position. The narrow strait known today as the Dardanelles was, Achaea, in antiquity, the Hellespont. At its mouth, ships passed between the Aegean and the Black Sea, carrying goods that sustained distant lands. This passage was not wide. Strong currents pulled southward, making navigation difficult. To move through safely required skill, favorable winds, and sometimes assistance from those who knew the waters well. Troy, positioned nearby, became a natural overseer of this crossing. What passed through these straits? The list was long and vital. From the north came grain, harvested on the fertile plains around the Black Sea. Timber, cut from dense forests, also traveled south, essential for shipbuilding and construction. Hides, furs, and honey may also have been carried in holds. In return, the ships brought southward goods that the northern regions lacked: wine from the Aegean, oil from groves, bronze tools, and pottery. Every amphora, every plank of wood, every bundle of grain represented wealth for those who could control or tax Its movement. Troy did not need vast farmland to grow rich. Its prosperity lay in being a gatekeeper. Archaeologists have found evidence of imported pottery from Greece, Cyprus, and beyond within the ruins of Troy. These artifacts are not accidents. They are traces of exchange, proof that the city was integrated into the broader networks of the Bronze Age. Its markets would have been filled with goods, both local and foreign. Jars of oil from Crete, bronze weapons from Greece, fine textiles from Anatolia. Long before the clash of armies and the burning of walls, Troy's importance lay not in myth, but in geography. The city sat at the threshold of waters that connected to seas, the Aegean and the Black Sea. To modern eyes, this may seem an ordinary detail of maps and coastlines, but in the Bronze Age, it was everything. Troy's wealth, its survival, and perhaps even the wars waged against it flowed from this position. The narrow strait known today as the Dardanelles was, in antiquity, the Hellespont. At its mouth, ships passed between the Aegean and the Black Sea, carrying goods that sustained distant lands. This passage was not wide. Strong currents pulled southward, making navigation difficult. To move through safely required skill, favorable winds, and sometimes assistance from those who knew the waters well. Troy, positioned nearby, became a natural overseer of this crossing. What passed through these straits? The list was long and vital. From the north came grain, harvested on the fertile plains around the Black Sea. Timber, cut from dense forests, also traveled south, essential for shipbuilding and construction. Hides, furs, and honey may also have been carried in holds. In return, the ships brought southward goods that the northern regions lacked. Wine from the Aegean, oil from groves, bronze tools, and pottery. Every amphora, every plank of wood, every bundle of grain represented wealth for those who could control or tax it. Movement. Troy did not need vast farmland to grow rich. Its prosperity lay in being a gatekeeper. Archaeologists have found evidence of imported pottery from Greece, Cyprus, and beyond within the ruins of Troy. These artifacts are not accidents. They are traces of exchange, proof that the city was integrated into the broader networks of the Bronze Age. Its markets would have been filled with goods, both local and foreign. Jars of oil from Crete, bronze weapons from Greece, fine textiles from Anatolia, and exotic trinkets that traveled farther still. To imagine Troy's wealth is not to imagine palaces dripping with gold, but rather warehouses filled with goods in motion. Grain stored for shipment, amphorae stacked in rows, hides bundled for trade. Officials may have counted, weighed, and taxed these goods, ensuring that the city profited from the movement of others' labor. For the Messenian kings and Anatolian lords, this control was not trivial. To lose access to Troy was to lose access to trade routes that mattered for survival. Control of trade also meant control of diplomacy. A city that could facilitate or obstruct exchange gained influence disproportionate to its size. For this reason, Troy appears in Hittite records under the name Walusa, noted as a place of significance. To negotiate with Troy was to negotiate with a power that could shape access to the seas. In a world where famine might follow a single bad harvest, such control could mean life or death for distant kingdoms. But for the people of Troy themselves, what did this wealth mean? It likely appeared not as luxury, but as work. Dock workers unloading cargo, merchants weighing goods, scribes recording transactions. These were the daily rhythms of a trade hub. Families might see foreign sailors in their streets, hear new languages in their markets, and encounter customs from distant lands. The city's diversity, born from trade, was both its strength and its risk. For with foreigners came opportunity, but also rivalry. Night, when ships lay anchored near the coast and the fires of camps flickered, one could imagine the mingling of voices, Anatolian traders haggling with Greek sailors, Hittite envoys speaking of treaties, local farmers selling surplus grain. Troy was not an isolated fortress. It was a meeting ground. Its wealth, drawn from trade, made it visible, and in time, vulnerable. But behind this prosperity lay a question that would not go away. Could Troy maintain its role as gatekeeper, or would the ambition of others eventually seek to wrest that control away? Asterisk, the wealth of Troy did not arise in isolation. It was part of the great web of Bronze Age commerce, a network that linked lands from the Aegean to Mesopotamia, from Egypt to the Black Sea. To understand how Troy grew rich, one must trace the roots themselves, the paths of ships and caravans, the lines of exchange that carried both necessities and luxuries. The Black Sea region, lying to the north of Troy, was one of the most significant sources of grain in the ancient world. Its fertile plains produced surpluses that could feed distant populations. For the Mycenaean Greeks, whose rocky soil yielded little beyond what was needed for survival, the grain of the north was vital. Ships carried it through the Hellespont, and Troy stood watch over the passage. The city may not have controlled every vessel, but its presence was unavoidable. Taxes, tolls, or agreements could ensure that Troy profited from every sack of grain that passed its gates. Timber was another treasure of the Black Sea trade. Bronze Age societies depended on wood not only for building homes, but for constructing ships, carts, and tools. The dense forests of the north supplied beams that could not easily be found in the more barren landscapes of Greece. To secure timber was to secure mobility and strength. Troy, again, stood at the doorway of this exchange. From Anatolia, east and inland, came metals. Copper from Cypriot mines and tin from distant sources combined to create bronze, the essential alloy of the age. Without bronze, there were no swords, no plows, no armor. Control of trade routes meant control of the very materials that sustained civilizations. It is telling that so much of the archaeology of Troy reveals bronze objects, not necessarily manufactured there, but passing through, handled, exchanged, and carried onward. Southward, the Aegean and beyond offered their own goods. Olive oil, wine, and fine pottery from Crete and Greece traveled eastward. These goods were not only practical, but cultural. An amphora of oil was nourishment, but it was also a symbol of connection to distant lands. A finely decorated cup carried into Troy told a story of craftsmanship and exchange. Through such goods, Troy was tied not only to survival, but to identity, absorbing influences from many cultures. The Aluburan shipwreck, discovered off the coast of Turkey and dated to the late Bronze Age, illustrates this interconnectedness. Its cargo included copper, ingots, tin, ivory, glass beads, and luxury items from at least 7 different regions, though not directly linked to Troy. The ship shows the scale and diversity of goods that moved across the seas of which Troy was a part. To stand at Troy's harbor was to see a miniature of the Mediterranean itself, goods arriving from afar, departing again, the city enriched by their passage. This trade also shaped Troy's society. Merchants, artisans, and laborers were indispensable. The city's economy relied not only on farmers, but on those who managed warehouses, quartered accounts, and negotiated with foreigners. The presence of imported goods in Troy's archaeological layers shows that the city was not a passive recipient of wealth, but an active participant, skilled at integrating itself into the flows of the age. Yet with prosperity came vulnerability. Control of trade routes drew attention. Rival powers could not ignore Troy's role. The Mycenaean Greeks, seeking grain and timber, saw in Troy both a partner and an obstacle. The Hittites, seeking to protect their western frontier, regarded Troy as a valuable but sometimes unreliable ally. Each saw in the city an asset to be secured, a node too important to be left uncontrolled. For the Trojans themselves, this may have meant a life lived in the shadow of both wealth and threat. Prosperity filled their markets, but danger always lingered at the edges. The same ships that brought goods could one day bring soldiers. The the same walls that watched over trade could be tested by siege. And so the question rises, did Troy grow rich because it mastered the roots of trade? Or did its wealth ensure that others would one day try to take that mastery away? Asterisk, to understand why Troy mattered, one must imagine the city not as a solitary fortress, but as a hub in a chain of movement. Every amphora that passed through, every plank of timber unloaded, every ingot of copper carried across its thresholds linked it to lands far beyond the horizon. Troy's wealth was not born of isolation, but of constant circulation. Archaeology reveals this clearly. Pottery styles found at Troy include imports from Greece, Crete, Cyprus, and the Levant. These shards, scattered in layers of earth, are like whispers of distant conversations. Each fragment tells us that Troy's people drank from cups made by foreign hands, stored food in jars painted with distant designs, and cooked with vessels shaped in far-off kilns. The city's identity was built not only from what it made, but from what it received. Trade also left its mark on Troy's architecture. Storage facilities large enough to hold surpluses suggest that the city was more than a consumer. It was a manager of flows. Goods may have been held temporarily, taxed, or redistributed. Officials, scribes, and overseers would have counted and weighed their clay tablets filled with records now lost to time. The wealth of Troy was not only in objects, but in systems of control, the ability to organize, channel, to profit from passage. Asterisk. Diplomatic texts from the Hittite archives remind us that Troy, known as Wailusa, stood within a larger political world. Treaties bound it to the Hittite kings, but such bonds were fragile. In times of peace, Troy's role as gatekeeper of trade made it a valuable ally. In times of conflict, it became a point of contention. Was Troy loyal to the Hittites, or did it lean toward the Mycenaeans? Did it resist both, trying to maintain independence while profiting from their rivalry? Each choice carried risk, for neutrality could be seen as defiance, and defiance as provocation. The ordinary people of Troy lived these realities in quiet ways. Dock workers carried amphorae from ships to warehouses, their backs bent under the weight of commerce. Market vendors sold fish, bread, oil, and wine to sailors from distant lands, their stalls filled with voices in multiple tongues. Children may have played among jars stacked for shipment, unaware that their city's prosperity depended on currents of exchange as vast as the seas themselves. At night, when the harbor grew quiet, the city must have reflected on its precarious fortune. The same winds that carried ships also carried threats. A storm could sink vessels before they arrived. A dispute between kingdoms could close routes overnight. A rival power could decide that Troy's tolls were too heavy, its influence too dangerous. Wealth, in this sense, was as fragile as pottery, easily broken, never fully secure. And yet, this fragility was the very reason Troy became legendary. Its riches drew the gaze of kings, its location made it indispensable, and its role as a crossroads ensured that no empire could ignore it. Troy was not merely a backdrop for myth. It was a city whose prosperity embodied the strengths and weaknesses of the Bronze Age world. Which leaves us with a final thought. Was Troy destroyed because of one insult told in poetry, or because it sat on the fault line of trade, too wealthy, too strategic, too essential to be left alone. Asterisk, the Trojan War, remembered in epic poetry, is often told as a clash of heroes, their armor shining, their swords flashing. But behind the stories of Achilles and Hector lies the reality of Bronze Age warfare. To understand the conflict around Troy, we must set aside myth and look at the weapons, tactics, technologies of the time, tools shaped by human hands, born of necessity, and carried into battle not by demigods, but by ordinary men. The age itself was defined by bronze. Tin was both the strength and the limitation of the era. Copper was abundant in places like Cyprus, but tin was rare, sourced from distant lands, perhaps Anatolia, Central Asia, or even as far as Britain. Without tin, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there were no swords, spearheads, or plowshares. Every weapon that gleamed on the battlefield at Troy was the product of long chains of mining, smelting, trade, and craftsmanship. The sword of the Trojan Age was long and narrow, designed more for thrusting than for slashing. Many examples have been found in graves across the Mycenaean world. Blades of bronze, sometimes decorated with inlays of gold or ivory. Such swords were symbols of status as much as tools of war. Ordinary soldiers may have carried simpler versions, while the elite wore finely crafted weapons meant to display their rank as much as to kill. Spears, however, were the true backbone of warfare, easier to produce, longer in reach, and more versatile in battle. The spear was the weapon of both elite warriors and common soldiers. Bronze spearheads, socketed onto wooden shafts, could be used for thrusting in close combat or thrown at a distance. Archaeological finds show that spearheads were among the most common weapons of the age. Their practicality ensuring their dominance. Shields provided protection, though their forms varied. In Mycenaean art, large figure-eight shields made of wood and leather appear, covering the body almost entirely. Other examples suggest smaller, round shields, easier to carry and more flexible in combat. None were indestructible against a determined thrust. Even the largest shield could fail, leaving the warrior exposed. Protection was always a matter of chance and skill. Armor was rare and precious. The famous Dendra panoply, discovered in a Greek tomb, shows what elite warriors might have worn: a full suit of bronze plates covering chest, shoulders, and legs. Yet such armor was heavy, costly, and impractical for most. The majority of fighters likely wore only simple tunics, perhaps reinforced with leather or small bronze scales if they were fortunate. Helmets, often made from boars, tusks, or bronze, offered some defense, though they too were reserved for those of higher status. Chariots played a role as well, though not as the battlefield tanks of later ages. In the Trojan Age, chariots were likely used as platforms for mobility, to carry elite warriors swiftly to the front, or to pursue fleeing enemies. Linear B. Tablets from Pylos record inventories of chariots, wheels, and harnesses, suggesting that palaces maintained fleets for war. Yet, their effectiveness in the rocky landscapes of Greece and Anatolia may have been limited. Still, they carried prestige. A warrior who fought from a chariot marked himself as elite, visible above the press of infantry. Bows and arrows offered another dimension. Though not celebrated in poetry, archery was a practical and deadly part of Bronze Age warfare. Arrowheads of bronze and flint alike have been found in sites across the region. Archers could harry advancing troops, defend walls, or strike from a distance in ways that swords and spears could not. Their role may have been less glamorous, but it was essential. Warfare itself was not a constant, but a seasonal act. Armies marched when crops were harvested and supplies available. Campaigns may have lasted weeks or months, but sustaining forces for years required extraordinary logistics. This makes the tradition of a 10-year Trojan War less likely as literal truth, but more plausible as memory of prolonged conflict, perhaps repeated campaigns, sieges, or raids across seasons for the men who fought. War was not heroic, but harsh. Weapons were heavy, armor scarce, and wounds often fatal. A bronze blade could shatter bones, a spear could pierce lungs, an arrow could cripple. Infection followed even minor injuries, and the dead were many. The poetry remembers duels, but the reality was lines of men pressing against one another, shields locking, spears thrusting, and fear ever present. This, then, was the reality of weapons and warfare in the Trojan Age, not a stage for gods, but a contest fought with bronze, sweat, and blood. Every sword, every shield, every chariot carried with it the weight of the world that produced it. But it leaves us with a question. When armies gathered at Troy's walls, did the weapons decide the war, or was it the resources behind them? The trade and labor that armed men long before they set foot on the battlefield. The picture of warfare in the Trojan Age becomes sharper when we look at how weapons and armies were supplied, organized, and deployed. Mycenaean palaces and Anatolian strongholds were not chaotic gatherings of warriors, but carefully managed centers of production and mobilization. The mythic image of heroes clashing on open fields hides the quieter, more practical reality. Armies were built on the labor of farmers, smiths, and administrators who never saw the battlefield. Bronze was the lifeblood of this system, but producing it required enormous effort. Copper and tin had to be mined, often from distant lands. Cyprus was a key source of copper, while tin was so rare that it traveled through long-distance networks, reaching from as far as Central Asia or the distant West. These metals were shipped, traded, and refined, passing through many hands before reaching smiths in Greece or Anatolia. The war at Troy, therefore, began not with swords drawn, but with oars mined in distant mountains, once in the hands of craftsmen. Bronze was shaped into weapons with care. Archaeological finds show a variety of blades, each suited for different uses. Long rapiers for thrusting, shorter swords for cutting, small knives for daily use or combat emergencies. Spears were mass-produced, their bronze heads socketed onto wooden shafts of ash or oak. The spear's simplicity made it the weapon of the many, while swords remained symbols of the few. Each finished weapon carried within it the marks of its maker's skill: hammered edges, polished blades, inlays of bone or ivory for those of higher rank. The organization of armies followed palace structures. Linear B tablets record allocations of chariots, suits of armor, and groups of men. These were not spontaneous levies, but organized forces called upon when rulers demanded. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen left their workshops, and fishermen left their nets, joining ranks when war required. Behind every soldier stood the quiet absence of his labor at home, a cost measured in reduced harvests and fewer goods in markets. Siege warfare, often associated with Troy, was a slow and grinding affair. Bronze Age armies lacked the advanced siege engines of later times, but they relied on persistence, encampments, and attrition. Armies could cut off supplies, harass defenders, and wait for hunger or disease to weaken a city. Wooden ladders, rams, and simple scaling devices may have been used. The picture of warfare in the Trojan Age becomes sharper when we look at how weapons and armies were supplied, organized, and deployed. Mycenaean palaces and Anatolian strongholds were not chaotic gatherings of warriors, but carefully managed centers of production and mobilization. The mythic image of heroes clashing on open fields hides the quieter, more practical reality. Armies were built on the labor of farmers, smiths, and administrators who never saw the battlefield. Bronze was the lifeblood of this system, but producing it required enormous effort. Copper and tin had to be mined, often from distant lands. Cyprus was a key source of copper, while tin was so rare that it traveled through long-distance networks, reaching from as far as Central Asia or the distant West. These metals were shipped, traded, and refined, passing through many hands before reaching smiths in Greece or Anatolia. The war at Troy, therefore, began not with swords drawn, but with oars mined in distant mountains. Once in the hands of craftsmen, bronze was shaped into weapons with care. Archaeological finds show a variety of blades, each suited for different uses: long rapiers for thrusting, shorter swords for cutting, small knives for daily use or combat emergencies. Spears were mass-produced, their bronze heads socketed onto wooden shafts of ash or oak. The spear's simplicity made it the weapon of the many, while swords remained symbols of the few. Each finished weapon carried within it the marks of its maker's skill: hammered edges, polished blades, inlays of bone or ivory for those of higher rank. The organization of armies followed palace structures. Linear B tablets record allocations of chariots, suits of armor, and groups of men. These were not spontaneous levies, but organized forces, called upon when rulers demanded. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen left their workshops, and fishermen left their nets, joining ranks when war required. Behind every soldier stood the quiet absence of his labor at home, a cost measured in reduced harvests and fewer goods in markets. Siege warfare, often associated with Troy, was a slow and grinding affair. Bronze Age armies lacked the advanced siege engines of later times, but they relied on persistence, encampments, and attrition. Armies could cut off supplies, harass defenders, and wait for hunger or disease to weaken a city. Wooden ladders, rams, and simple scaling devices may have been used, but more often walls were challenged, not by storm, but by time. To endure such sieges, both attackers and defenders needed vast stores of food, patience, and discipline. Chariots, often highlighted in poetry, served practical functions but were not decisive in sieges. They offered mobility on open plains, allowing commanders and elite warriors to move swiftly, to intimidate, and to pursue. But when armies pressed against stone walls, the chariot's advantage faded. The true work of conquest fell to infantrymen with spears, bows, and shields, pressing in lines, exposed to missiles from above. Archaeological discoveries also showed that archery played a larger role than epic tradition admits. Arrowheads litter ancient sites, made from bronze and flint alike. Their presence suggests volleys of arrows fired from walls, from ambushes, and from organized ranks of archers. A single arrow may not bring glory in song, but it was often the weapon that ended lives quietly from a distance, in ways that stories chose to forget. The psychological side of warfare cannot be overlooked. To face battle in the Trojan Age was to carry not only bronze weapons, but fear. Soldiers had little protection, and wounds were often fatal. Helmets of boar's tusks or bronze plates offered some defense, but gaps remained. Shields could splinter, spears could pierce, swords could cut deeply. Many must have fought, knowing survival was uncertain. Their courage less the stuff of legend than of endurance in the face of necessity. The burden of warfare also extended to those who remained at home. Families lost laborers, fields went untilled, and women, children, and elders bore the weight of maintaining households during absence. War was not simply a matter of glory, but of disruption. Economies strained, lives altered, futures uncertain, and so, when we strip away the heroic veneer, the weapons and warfare of the Trojan Age emerge as both ordinary and brutal. Spears, bows, shields, and bronze blades, tools forged in quiet workshops, carried into noisy battlefields, used by men who were less heroes than survivors. Which leads us to wonder, was the outcome of the Trojan War decided by the strength of warriors in combat, or by the patience of those who supplied them, feeding armies across years of struggle? Asterisk, the final view of Trojan Age warfare must widen beyond weapons and armies to the larger systems that shaped conflict. For wars were not won solely on the battlefield, but through the endurance of societies, the supply of resources, and the organization of people far from the front lines. The siege of a city like Troy would not have been a single event, but a prolonged test of resilience. For the attackers, success depended on sustaining an army across seasons. Supplies of grain, oil, and wine had to be shipped from homelands or seized from nearby lands. Livestock grazed in the fields around encampments, their presence marking both sustenance and vulnerability. A siege demanded not only courage, but logistics, the unseen network of carts, ships, and workers who kept men fed. For the defenders, survival depended on their walls, their stores, and their unity. Archaeological evidence at Troy reveals large storage jars buried into the earth, filled with grain and provisions. Such reserves were not luxuries, but necessities. A city under siege could endure for months, even years, if food was carefully rationed. Yet every day of survival strained morale. The sound of arrows clattering against shields, the cries of watchmen on the walls, the sight of smoke rising from enemy camps. These were daily reminders that safety was temporary. Weapons themselves bore silent witness to these struggles. Bronze spearheads and arrowheads scattered in the soil tell us that battles were fought, both at the walls and on the plains beyond. Each fragment of metal is a trace of a clash, a life ended, a moment of violence, now quiet. For archaeologists, these objects are data. For the men who once carried them, they were matters of life and death. The poetry of Homer celebrates duels Achilles facing Hector, heroes clashing in single combat. The reality was more collective, less glorious. Lines of infantry pressed together, spears thrust forward, shields overlapped. The noise was deafening, the dust thick, the outcome uncertain. Victory was not the triumph of one hero, but the grinding of one line against another until one broke. The killing was impersonal, the wounds fatal, the glory fleeting. Chariots, though often depicted in art, played only limited roles in siege conditions. Their true use may have been in skirmishes on open ground, where speed and shock could decide smaller encounters. Archers, often overlooked, became essential in both offense and defense, their volleys raining down in moments when the clash of infantry paused. The defenders of Troy would have relied heavily on archers, shooting from walls to thin the ranks of attackers below. One of the stark truths of Bronze Age warfare is its cost. Weapons and armor were expensive, lives were fragile, and outcomes uncertain. Every campaign carried risks, not only for soldiers, but for entire communities. A failed war could bankrupt a palace, starve a region, or topple a king. Success, too, carried its burdens. Captured lands had to be controlled, captives absorbed, spoils distributed. War was never simple victory or defeat, but an ongoing cycle of survival. And so, when we picture the Trojan War in its historical setting, it becomes less a stage for gods and heroes, and more a mirror of Bronze Age realities. Spears, shields, bows, and bronze blades, crafted with difficulty, wielded with fear, remembered with loss. Armies, fed by distant farmers, armed by unseen smiths, driven by rulers whose ambitions stretched beyond their means. A war of endurance, not of glory. This leaves us with a question that lingers like the silence after battle. Did the fate of Troy rest on the weapons in men's hands, or on the fragile systems of supply and survival that armed them in the first place? The tales of Troy often dwell on its fall, its flames, its final battle. But long before that night of destruction, the city was full of life. To picture Troy at its height, before the war began, is to imagine a community where ordinary rhythms sustained extraordinary walls. A city alive with markets, workshops, families, and the countless details of survival. Within the fortifications of stone and mud brick, houses pressed close together along winding streets. Most were built with simple plans. A main room with a hearth at its center. Perhaps a small courtyard and storage spaces tucked into corners. Roofs were flat, supported by wooden beams, sometimes used for drying grain or airing laundry. Floors were of packed earth, swept daily, but never perfectly clean. Smoke from cooking fires stained the ceilings, giving interiors a darkened, lived-in appearance. Asterisk. The day began early. At dawn, the sound of animals filled the streets. Donkeys braying, roosters crowing, sheep bleating as they were led out to pasture. Farmers and herders left through the city gates, guiding animals or carrying tools, their day's work taking them beyond the walls to the fields and hills. Inside the city, others stayed behind, potters tending their kilns, smiths hammering bronze, women drawing water from wells. Markets with a heart of Troy's daily rhythm. Along the main streets or open courtyards, traders laid out goods, jars of olive oil, baskets of figs, loaves of barley bread, still warm from ovens. Foreign merchants appeared too, their accents marking them as strangers. A Mycenaean sailor might barter for dried fish, while an Anatolian trader offered copper, ingots, or wool. In such exchanges, the diversity of Troy revealed itself. Many languages may have been heard in a single morning. Each transaction a thread binding the city to the wider world. Children filled the gaps between these activities with their own play. Clay figurines and small carved toys have been found by archaeologists, suggesting games that echoed adult life. Boys may have pretended to be warriors with sticks as spears, while girls shaped miniature pots from mud. Their laughter mixed with the noises of work, a reminder that even in a city destined for destruction, childhood carried on. Religion shaped the rhythm of days as well. Small household shrines may have been found in homes. Simple altars where offerings of grain or wine were made to protective spirits. Larger public rituals, perhaps conducted near the citadel, brought the community together. Priests oversaw sacrifices, a goat or sheep, its blood offered to the gods, its meat shared among participants. These rituals were not occasional spectacles, but regular affirmations that the gods watched, that life was ordered, that chaos could be held at bay. Craftsmen played vital roles. Smiths forged bronze tools and weapons, the sound of their hammers carrying down the lanes. Potters shaped jars, amphorae, and cups, their kilns filling the air with the scent of smoke and clay. Weavers worked at looms, creating textiles that clothed the city, and perhaps traveled as far as Greece or Egypt. The work was repetitive, but it tied the community together. Every task, no matter how dull, had its place in sustaining life. Meals were simple, shaped by what could be grown or traded. Barley formed the staple, ground into flour for bread or boiled into porridge. Lentils, peas, and beans added variety. Fish from the nearby coast appeared often, as did goats, milk, and cheese. Meat was less common, eaten mostly during sacrifices or special occasions. Figs, olives, and honey-sweetened diets when available. Each household cooked at its hearth. The smell of stews and baked bread drifting through narrow lanes. At night, the city did not fall silent. Fires glowed in courtyards, oil lamps flickered in homes, and music drifted through the air. Lyres and flutes accompanied songs, some for celebration, others for prayer. Storytelling, too, was central. Elders recited tales of ancestors, battles, or distant lands, shaping memory and identity. It was in such gatherings that myths began. long before they were written in epic verse. Yet, beneath these rhythms lay constant awareness of danger. The walls were not ornamental. Watchmen stood at gates, their eyes scanning the plains. Rumors of raids or rival armies were never distant, and every household knew that safety was never permanent. Still, life went on, for it had to. The resilience of daily life was Troy's greatest defense, more enduring than weapons or kings. And so, to imagine Troy before the war is not to imagine heroes in armor, but children playing in dust, women weaving at looms, traders shouting prices in the market, and farmers returning at dusk with tools over their shoulders. A city of ordinary lives, extraordinary only because history later remembered its end. But one must ask, did the people of Troy, in their quiet routines, ever sense that their city's prosperity also painted a target on its walls? Asterisk, to understand Troy not as legend, but as lived reality, we must slow down and enter its streets, its homes, its workshops. The city, surrounded by walls of stone, was no mythical stage, but a working community. Its survival depended not on heroes, but on the countless ordinary acts that took place every day. The architecture of Troy reveals much about its people. Excavations show clusters of houses built close together, sharing walls, forming neighborhoods where life was intimate. In such places, privacy was rare. Neighbors heard each other's arguments, smelled each other's cooking, and shared each other's burdens. Life was communal, shaped as much by proximity as by family. Water was a constant concern. Wells dug within the city provided some supply, but they required maintenance, and in times of siege, water became a matter of survival. Women often carried jars to and from wells, balancing them on shoulders or heads. The clatter of ceramic against stone, the murmur of conversations at water sources were daily sounds. These scenes, repeated endlessly, bound the community together in ordinary labor. Inside the homes, the hearth was the center of life. Meals were cooked in clay pots, smoke rising into rafters. Bread was baked on hot stones. Stews simmered slowly, filling rooms with warmth and scent. Family members gathered around a fire, not only for food, but for light and companionship. The hearth was both practical and sacred, a place where ancestors were remembered and offerings made to household gods. Workshops hummed with their own rhythms. Smiths bent over forges, shaping bronze into tools and weapons. Potters turned clay on wheels, their hands steady, their kilns glowing. Weavers worked at looms, the sound of shuttles clicking back and forth. Each craft had its own pace, its own demands, and together they formed the pulse of the city. Goods produced here were not only for local use, but for trade, feeding into the networks that made Troy prosperous. Markets were scenes of movement and negotiation. Farmers brought produce from the fields, bunches of onions, baskets of legumes, skins of goat's milk. Fishermen carried their catches from the coast. Traders laid out foreign wares, pottery from Greece, copper ingots from Anatolia, perhaps even beads of glass from distant lands. The noise of barter, the gestures of hands, the calls of sellers filled the air. Here, the city was most alive, most diverse. Its wealth visible in every transaction. Children and elders alike played roles in this world. Children fetched water, gathered firewood, or herded small animals. Elders, no longer able to labor in fields or workshops, shared stories and advice. Knowledge passed orally, shaping memory and identity. The city was sustained not only by work, but by continuity. The passing of wisdom across generations. Religion infused daily life as quietly as labor. Small altars stood in courtyards, decorated with offerings of grain, wine, or oil. Larger rituals, held at sanctuaries or open spaces, drew communities together. Priests conducted sacrifices, invoking deities for protection and prosperity. These acts reaffirmed social bonds, reminding the people that they shared more than streets and markets, that they were united under the watch of the divine. Even leisure was communal. Music and song-filled evenings. The lyre, strummed by skilled hands, accompanied tales of ancestors and journeys. Dances may have been performed in circles, steps, simple but powerful in their shared rhythm. Such moments gave relief from labor, but also reinforced unity. In times of uncertainty, these traditions provided strength. Still, shadows lay over this daily life. The walls of Troy were reminders that prosperity carried risks. Traders who brought wealth could also bring spies. Neighbors across the sea could become enemies. Every watchman at the gates, every patrol on the walls, embodied the truth that Troy's safety was fragile. Yet the people endured, balancing fear with routine, danger with resilience. This brings us to a subtle question. When Trojans walked their markets and prayed at their altars, did they see themselves as ordinary people of a thriving city, or did some sense that history's gaze already rested on their walls, waiting for the moment when peace would shatter? Asterisk, the heart of Troy was not its kings or its walls, but its people living lives that were both ordinary and essential. To picture the city fully, one must linger on the smallest details: the texture of woven cloth, the smell of baking bread, the murmur of conversations in shaded courtyards. These fragments, though humble, formed the reality of Troy's existence before war reshaped it into legend. Archaeological evidence suggests that households were centers of production as much as of family life. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and weaving tools found in Troy's ruins reveal that textile making was one of the most common activities. Women and girls spent long hours spinning wool, weaving cloth, and dyeing fabrics. This work not only clothed their families, but also produced goods for trade, linking domestic labor to the city's prosperity. The rhythm of the loom, repetitive, steady, echoed through many homes, a quiet heartbeat of survival. Food preparation, too, was labor-intensive. Grains had to be ground by hand using stone querns, a task that consumed much of the day. Vegetables were chopped, stews stirred, and bread baked on hot stones or in clay ovens. Each meal was the result of hours of preparation, performed daily without pause. Archaeological finds of grinding stones worn smooth tell the story of countless hands repeating the same action across generations. Community was built not only in labor, but in sharing. Meals were often communal, extended families gathering together, neighbors sharing food in times of need. In moments of celebration, a harvest, a marriage, a religious festival, the city came alive with feasts. Music, dancing, and sacrifice transformed routine into ritual, binding the community together through joy as much as through necessity. Children were absorbed into these rhythms from a young age. Boys may have learned farming, herding, or smithing by watching their fathers. Girls learned spinning and weaving at their mothers' sides. Play was interwoven with training, toys often miniature versions of adult tools or weapons. In this way, the city ensured continuity, each generation stepping into the roles of the last. Health and medicine, though limited, were part of daily concern. Herbs, poultices, and charms were used to treat illness. Priests or healers may have invoked the gods alongside remedies, for sickness was seen not only as physical, but spiritual. Survival was uncertain. Infant mortality was high, and even small injuries could become fatal. Yet, the persistence of life in Troy shows resilience. Families endured, children grew, and the city thrived despite hardship. Night brought its own rhythms. Oil lamps flickered in homes, casting shadows on plastered walls. Courtyards filled with cool air after the heat of the day. Songs and stories carried into the darkness, telling of ancestors, heroes, or distant lands. Such stories, repeated over generations, became the seeds of memory that later blossomed into epics. The myths of Troy did not emerge suddenly. They grew from these quiet evenings, shaped by countless voices. Through it all, the city lived with the knowledge of its vulnerability. Watchtowers and guards reminded the people that wealth attracted enemies. Markets filled with foreign goods also carried foreign whispers. Every sign of prosperity was also a reminder of risk. Yet, the people did not live in constant fear. They lived in continuity, balancing danger with determination. And so, daily life inside Troy was not a tale of heroes, but of endurance. Women weaving cloth in courtyards, men hammering bronze in workshops, children chasing each other through narrow lanes, elders telling stories by lamplight. Their lives were not extraordinary in their own time, but they became extraordinary because history remembered what came after. This leaves us with a reflective question. When the Trojans went about their daily routines, did they imagine their lives would one day be remembered not for themselves, but only as the prelude to a city's fall? Asterisk, when the war against Troy is remembered, it is often through the clash of warriors and the burning of walls. Yet, behind every soldier stood families, and within the city itself, women bore the greatest weight of endurance. Their lives during the long years of conflict reveal a quieter history, one that rarely enters poetry, but shaped the reality of survival inside Troy's walls. Women became the keepers of continuity, with men absent in the fields of battle or guarding the walls. Households depended on wives, mothers, and daughters to sustain them. They fetched water from wells, ground grain into flour, wove cloth at looms, and tended children. These tasks, humble in appearance, became acts of resilience. Each loaf of bread, each garment woven, each child cared for ensured that the city did not collapse under the strain of war. Archaeological finds, loom weights, spindle whorls, grinding stones, speak to this labor. They are not dramatic artifacts, but they are the tools of survival. A woman at her loom was as vital to Troy as a soldier at the gates, for without her, the household would falter. In this way, the war years magnified the importance of domestic labor, even as tradition left it unsung. Religious roles also fell heavily upon women. In many Bronze Age cultures, women acted as priestesses, leading rituals for fertility, protection, and continuity. Within Troy, such figures may have guided ceremonies to sustain morale, offering sacrifices to household gods and to greater deities for protection of the city. Even ordinary women participated in ritual, pouring libations at altars, leaving offerings at shrines, teaching children prayers. These small acts created a rhythm of faith that counterbalanced the fear of war. Families adapted as best they could. With men away, older children took on responsibilities earlier. Boys tended animals, tilled fields, or guarded the city in minor roles. Girls learned weaving and food preparation at younger ages, carrying burdens their mothers had once shared. Elders, too, stepped in, guiding households with their knowledge and memory. The city became a patchwork of resilience, each generation bearing part of the strain. Marriage and kinship ties became deeply entwined with the war effort. Families offered sons to the defense of the city, but they also relied on marriage alliances for stability. Even in wartime, weddings took place, though more modest than in times of peace. Such unions reinforced community bonds, tying families together in networks of mutual support. A daughter's marriage could ensure alliances between households, providing both practical help and morale in difficult times. The grief of war also shaped family life. Women bore the brunt of loss, mourning husbands, brothers, and sons who did not return. Laments, sung in courtyards or whispered at graves, became part of the soundscape of the city. Archaeological parallels from other cultures show women leading mourning rituals, carrying garments, cutting hair, or singing dirges. These acts, both personal and communal, gave voice to the pain that war inflicted. Daily survival was never certain. Sieges strained resources, and it was often women who rationed food, stretching stores to feed children, elders, and themselves. Malnutrition and illness shadowed households, and mothers carried the heaviest burden of trying to protect the vulnerable. The act of feeding a child became became both an ordinary duty and an extraordinary challenge, magnified by the pressures of war. And yet, even under these conditions, moments of joy persisted. Children still played in courtyards. Women still gathered to share tasks and stories. Families still marked seasonal festivals with what little they could spare. The resilience of women and families was not only in enduring hardship, but in preserving humanity amid struggle. So when we remember the Trojan War, we must ask, was the city truly defended only by warriors on its walls, or also by the countless women within whose daily labor, faith, and endurance held the fabric of Troy together through years of siege? Asterisk, when the long war dragged on, year after year, women and families became the hidden engine of Troy's endurance. Their roles expanded not only in the household, but also in the wider fabric of the city. To see their importance clearly, one must look at the quiet labors that filled every day and the unseen sacrifices that made survival possible. The loom was one of the most important instruments of the war years. Women wove cloth not only for their families, but also for the soldiers on the walls. Garments, tunics, and cloaks had to be replaced regularly. Without women's labor, armies would have been left exposed to weather and wear. Linen and wool, spun into thread and woven into fabric, sustained the defense of the city as surely as bronze did. The repetition of weaving, the hum of spinning, became a steady rhythm of contribution. Every soldier on the wall carried not only a weapon, but also the hidden work of women who clothed him. Food production, too, shifted under their care. Men might raid or defend, but women tended gardens, baked bread, preserved food, and rationed supplies. Archaeological evidence of large storage jars within Troy suggests that provisions were carefully managed. Women oversaw these stores, deciding how much could be spared each day, to stretch grain across weeks, to water down wine so that it lasted longer, to portion meat only for festivals. These were acts of strategy, no less important than tactics in battle. Asterisk, religion remained a source of stability. In times of fear, women led or participated in rituals that gave meaning to suffering. Figurines of mother goddesses found in the ruins of Troy and other Anatolian sites remind us of the protective role of female deities. Women likely invoked these powers, offering prayers for fertility of the earth, safety of children, and protection of the city. Sacrifices, whether of animals or symbolic offerings, allowed families to feel connected to forces larger than themselves. Reinforcing endurance, motherhood during war carried particular burdens. To raise children in a city under siege meant shielding them from fear while teaching them resilience. Mothers told stories by lamplight, perhaps softening the world's dangers with tales of heroes or ancestors. They guided children in small chores that gave them purpose, fetching water, gathering firewood, caring for animals. These small tasks prepared the young for the adult burdens they would inevitably inherit. Asterisk. Families also became units of defense in less direct ways. Men not fighting at the walls were still needed for guard duties, for repairing fortifications, for carrying supplies. Women and children supported these efforts by bringing food to workers, tending wounds, or maintaining order at home so men could focus on their tasks. The war blurred the lines between military and civilian roles, drawing every hand into the effort of survival. Grief, however, was constant. Funerals within the walls became more frequent. Women led mourning rituals, their voices rising in lament. The act of keening, crying aloud in rhythmic, poetic form, was both personal expression and communal release. These laments, preserved in fragments across cultures, remind us that grief was not silent. It was woven into the city's memory, shaping how Troy remembered its losses. Despite these hardships, resilience defined family life. Weddings still occurred, though modestly, binding households together in alliances of support. Births still took place, even amid war, bringing new life into a city under threat. Festivals, though reduced, were still observed, offering moments of relief and community. These continuities ensured that Troy did not simply endure as a fortress, but as a living society. The war years thus transformed the roles of women and families into something larger than themselves. Their labor clothed armies, their rationing sustained households, their rituals preserved faith, their resilience carried the city. Without them, the war could not have lasted as long as it did. But this leads us to ask, when Troy finally fell, were the conquerors striking down only soldiers? Or were they destroying the very fabric woven by generations of women and families who had kept this city alive? Asterisk, as the war stretched from months into years, the endurance of Troy depended not only on its warriors, but on the countless acts carried out in homes, courtyards, and workshops. Women and families were the backbone of this endurance, and their contributions reveal a dimension of the Trojan War often forgotten in later legend. The continuity of households was one of their greatest achievements. Even as men left to fight or died in battle, women kept the rhythm of domestic life steady. This stability mattered deeply. Children who were fed, clothed, and cared for grew into the next generation of defenders and laborers. Elders who were supported by their families preserved memory and guidance. Without this quiet constancy, the city would have dissolved long before its walls were breached. In times of siege, the ingenuity of women became critical. Food was stretched in every way possible. Grains were ground more finely to yield large amounts of flour. Bread was baked thinner, and stews were watered down to feed more mouths. Families learned to substitute wild greens gathered outside the walls, dried fish preserved from earlier catches, legumes stored in clay jars. Women made survival strategies out of scarcity, feeding hope alongside hunger. Healing also became part of their work. While warriors carried bronze weapons, women carried herbs, poultices, and bandages. Wounds from spears or arrows often proved fatal, but smaller injuries, cuts, burns, fevers, demanded care. Women passed down knowledge of plants, roots, and remedies, blending medicine with ritual. A poultice of crushed herbs might be applied with a whispered prayer, each act of healing both practical and spiritual. Children's lives were inevitably shaped by war. Some grew up never knowing peace, their earliest memories filled with the sound of horns on the walls or the sight of soldiers drilling in courtyards. Mothers and grandmothers bore the burden of shielding them from fear, yet also taught them resilience. Tasks were given early, carrying water, watching animals, grinding grain. Play still existed, but it was shadowed by duty. These children were not only the future of families, but of the city itself. Trained quietly in the arts of survival, marriage and kinship networks carried even greater weight during the war years. Families sought strength through alliances, binding themselves together in webs of obligation and support. A wedding, even under siege, was a declaration that life would continue. Births, too, were moments of defiance against despair. Each child born within the walls was a sign that Troy's spirit had not yet been extinguished. That continuity would outlast destruction, yet sorrow was never absent. Women filled the city with lament for the dead husbands, sons, brothers lost in battle. These laments were not merely private grief, but communal acts, binding the city in shared mourning. They gave voice to loss, ensuring that those who fell were remembered, even if only for a time. The sound of lamentation became part of Troy's identity, echoing through its streets as much as the sound of forges or marketplaces once had. In this way, women and families transformed the war years into more than a story of siege. They carried forward the threads of daily life, weaving survival through routine, resilience through ritual, hope through hardship, while the warriors of Troy fought on its walls. It was the women who sustained the city within, holding together a fragile world under relentless pressure. And here lies the deeper reflection. When Troy finally burned, it was not only the end of warriors' glory, but also the silencing of countless women's songs, the breaking of families who had labored so long to preserve the city's life. Their story, though seldom told, is as much a part of the Trojan War as the clash of bronze and the fall of towers. Asterisk. The tradition that the Trojan War lasted 10 years has puzzled historians for centuries. Could an army truly remain so long before a city's walls? Myth makes it sound inevitable, but history urges us to consider the practical realities of survival. For the armies outside Troy, endurance required more than courage. It demanded food, water, shelter, and constant replenishment of supplies. The story of the siege, when stripped of legend, becomes a study in logistics. Armies in the Bronze Age were not permanent standing forces. They were drawn from farmers, craftsmen, and sailors called to arms by their rulers. To sustain them over years required extraordinary organization. Every soldier consumed food each day, grain for bread, meat when available, wine or water for drink. Thousands of men meant thousands of mouths, and the supplies had to come from somewhere. The Aegeans, the Greek coalition, could not have survived entirely on what they brought with them. Ships carried stores at the outset, but these dwindled quickly. To endure, the armies must have drawn on the surrounding land. Raids into the countryside, seizures of villages, and plunder of nearby towns likely provided much of their sustenance. Archaeological hints of destruction in coastal Anatolia during this period may reflect such campaigns. The war, then, was not only against Troy, but against its neighbors. Its resources were consumed to feed the besiegers. Fishing also played a role. The Aegean coast provided ample opportunity to catch fish, a steady supplement to grain and meat. Salted or dried, fish could be preserved for longer periods. Herds of livestock, brought across the sea or seized locally, added another layer of supply. Sheep and goats provided both meat and milk. Their presence, a reminder that armies were not only warriors, but herders, cooks, and laborers. Shelter was another concern. An army cannot remain for years in the open without consequence. Tents and huts must have filled the beaches and plains near Troy, forming semi-permanent camps. These encampments became small cities in themselves, with spaces for cooking, storage, rituals, and even administration. The image of ships drawn up on the shore, men living between vessels and tents, reflects a reality of prolonged presence. Fires burned nightly, smoke rising into the sky. A constant reminder to Troy that the enemy was not leaving. Weapons and armor needed constant repair. Bronze dulls, cracks, and bends with use. Smiths within the camp worked steadily, melting down broken blades, reforging spearheads, repairing chariot parts. Each battle, each skirmish, left its mark not only on men, but on their equipment. Without smiths, the army would have withered long before Troy fell. Disease, too, was an inevitable companion. Armies living in close quarters with poor sanitation faced outbreaks of illness. Streams could be fouled, food spoiled, wounds infected. The Iliad itself remembers a plague striking the Aegean camp, a poetic memory of a very real risk. Survival, therefore, was not only about weapons and food, but also about avoiding the collapse of health in the ranks. Religion bound the camp together. Sacrifices to the gods, rituals before battles, and prayers in times of famine or plague gave order to an uncertain existence. Animals were offered at altars, their meat shared afterward, providing both nourishment and a sense of divine favor. The gods, invoked daily, gave meaning to hardship, and all the while, the siege was not constant battle, but long stretches of waiting. Men passed time with training, contests, and storytelling. Songs of ancestors, tales of distant lands, and laments for the dead-filled evenings. Life in the camp was a mixture of boredom, fear, and endurance. shaped less by combat than by survival. The tradition of a 10-year siege may compress many campaigns into one story, but it reflects a truth. Prolonged conflict was not about endless fighting, but about the ability of armies to endure. Their survival outside Troy's walls tells us as much about organization and resilience as it does about battle. Asterisk. If the war around Troy truly stretched across years, then it was not only weapons that sustained it, but systems of supply and endurance. The siege became less a story of daily battles and more a story of cycles, campaigns, pauses, harvests, and the endless need to feed thousands of men. The Aegean camp, drawn up along the coast, likely resembled a small city. Rows of tents and makeshift huts lined the beach. Ships hauled ashore, forming protective barriers. Fires smoked day and night, their ash carried inland on the wind. Paths formed between encampments, worn by constant movement. Commanders had their central quarters, where councils were held, while smiths, cooks, and common soldiers clustered in their own spaces. Over time, the camp developed its own order, not permanent, but stable enough to endure season after season. Food was the lifeblood of this camp. Raiding expeditions targeted surrounding villages, securing grain, livestock, and other goods. Records from the Hittite Empire describe raids in western Anatolia during the Late Bronze Age, perhaps echoes of these very events. Such raids were brutal, stripping local populations of their harvests, leaving behind hunger and ruin. For the besieging army, however, they were essential. Without constant resupply from the land, the camp could not have survived. Fishing supplemented these raids. Nets were cast into the sea, hooks baited, boats sent along the coast. Salted or smoked fish became a staple, stored for leaner times. Sheep and goats grazed near the camp, tended by men whose duties blurred between soldier and herder. Occasionally, cattle were seized, their slaughter providing feasts as well as offerings to the gods. The diet of the besiegers was never luxurious, but it was sufficient to endure. Water posed another challenge. Springs near the coast may have provided fresh supplies, but these were not always reliable. Wells may have been dug or streams diverted, but contamination was a constant risk. Disease spread quickly in crowded camps. The Iliad's memory of a plague among the Greeks reflects this reality. Armies pressed together. Sanitation, poor illness, inevitable. Survival required not only food and weapons, but luck and health. Weapons themselves demanded maintenance. Bronze was durable, but not eternal. Spears bent, swords dulled, shields splintered. Smiths in the camp recycled broken weapons, melting bronze for reuse, hammering it back into shape. Archaeological finds of casting molds, slag, and workshop remains from other sites suggest that mobile forges were part of campaigns. The war was therefore not just fought by soldiers, but sustained by craftsmen who labored in the background. Seasons structured the siege. Campaigning was most intense after harvests, when food was plentiful. Winter brought storms, making sea travel difficult and reducing activity. The camp endured through cycles of action and waiting, of sudden battles followed by long months of preparation. This rhythm explains how a war could stretch across years without constant fighting. Time passed as much in waiting as in war. Religion, too, was woven into these cycles. Sacrifices were offered before raids, libations poured before meals, prayers spoken at dawn and dusk. Animals, sheep, goats, cattle were slaughtered, their blood offered to the gods, their meat shared among the men. These rituals provided not only spiritual assurance, but practical nourishment. In the campfires that followed sacrifice, belief and survival mingled. Morale had to be maintained. Men, far from home, enduring hunger, loss, and disease, required more than orders. Leaders gave speeches, poets sang of ancestors, and contests were held. Races, wrestling, displays of strength. These diversions gave meaning to waiting, reminding men of who they were and why they endured. Stories told by lamplight-shaped memory, turning hardship into part of a greater cause. And all the while, Troy itself loomed in sight, its walls visible from the beach, its towers watching silently. To live year after year in the shadow of those walls was to live in tension, close enough to see the prize, yet too far to claim it. The siege was as much psychological as physical, a war of patience as much as of weapons. Which leaves us with a question. Did Troy fall because its walls were broken, or because its people, like those in the camp beyond, could no longer endure the strain of waiting? Asterisk, to imagine the Trojan War as a 10-year siege is to picture not a single unbroken battle, but a long endurance test. The fighting that filled songs and poetry may have been fierce, but the greatest struggle lay in simply remaining and holding ground, sustaining